Okay guys, welcome to the open grand final of the Taiwan Debate Open 2017. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far. Inside government we have UPM. And inside opposition we have Beauties and Bees. There will be a massive 9-man panel with myself as chair, huge, and like handling are like Ruben, Fabin, Eric, Biha, Andy, Nico, Vincent, and Say. If everyone's ready, without further ado, I have to call the house to order and invite the Prime Minister from Side Government to take a stand against me. Like a loud phone, like loud big people that are try to reach that. I don't think that's
Hello.
Actually, I think they just speak normally. The mic. Maybe get someone to like. Oh, good. Thanks. Thank you.
Since time immemorial, ladies and gentlemen, human interaction has formed a core aspect of the identity of every single individual. What we envision coming from government side is the removal of the ability to interact with other human beings as the ultimate form of punishment for criminals at the end of the day. The deprivation of their ability to socialize, to be a part of that particular society, to engage in meaningful discussions for a period of time to be determined by these courts. I don't think it's important that we talk about specific crimes and specific sentences. I think that this is a philosophical debate, or at least a debate about how we envision criminal justice ought to be. So, what does our world look like? First, obviously, given the info slide, we think that these prisoners, when they are subjected to a wipeout, will probably look like silhouettes, for example, in front of other prisoners and other members of society who might go or see them in the prisons, for example, that they are put in. Obviously, when we talk about the future prison system, we probably envision it to be more like the Scandinavian type of prison system and not some inhumane Abu Ghraib style prison. Because at that point in time, we think that the emphasis on punishment is put on the inability of these people to interact with others. Third, obviously, to a certain extent, we think that we can monitor what these people are doing in prisons. No, thank you. We can see them. We have maybe ankle bracelets to monitor where they are. They can obviously still eat, interact, for example, with like machines that will provide them with food. We assume that there's a lot of technology for that. Fourthly, no, thank you. We think that in terms of determining the length of time of sentence, we say that we can psychologically, through empirical evidence, determine the amount of time in which we can have this person realize the mistake that he has committed without destroying his psyche completely. I think the advances in the field of psychology will be able to do that. And obviously, these people can still access educational content and other material that is provided within prisons even right now. So that's very clear. No, thank you. The burden on our side, therefore, is to prove by the absence of social interaction and the ability to participate in that form of collective is the best form of punishment to achieve rehabilitation and deterrence for these prisoners. And why, in terms of punishment and retribution, this is what is commensurate. But yeah, go ahead.
Is there any specific crime or type of crime that this particular punishment will be actually very useful for?
I'm going to talk about that in my discussion because when you talk about, for example, anything from heinous crimes, for example, to like corporate crimes, theft, stealing, and all of these kinds of things, we think that any form of these particular crime that are considered crime against society, like for example, when you try it is the state of X versus this particular person, we say that this is the sort of crimes in which we can apply these sorts of things to. So for example, we think that civil crimes or civil suits obviously are not going to be a part of this debate. So let's first talk about human interaction. So we believe that as inherently social beings, obviously humans crave interaction. It forms a part of our identity, a large part of our identity. Like even psychopaths, for example, still crave interaction, whether it's with their victims or their soon-to-be victims or whatever. We say that even if they are put in in solitary confinement, for example, they still feel the effects of these things. Why is it that the prison structure in the world that we live in right now compared to our 50 years later world is worse off? Because when you think about it, Mr. Speaker, we say that in terms of optimizing criminal justice, in terms of retribution, if you look at the principle that underpins it, we say that we isolate people and we restrict their movement because we're trying to send a message that these people are distinct or are at that point in time, they committed a crime against everybody else, hence they need to be separated from them. But we would like to go a step further because isolation, which sends a message that at this point in time, your membership in that collective is suspended because of what you did, imprints in their minds the nature of what they have done, because it is to the extent that they need to be removed, not just removed by being separated in prison, but even removed from interacting with other prisoners. That is the extent of the harm that they've done for whatever period of time is determined by the courts and the psychologists, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you. Therefore, we think that in terms of rehabilitation, what would it look like when you only have yourself to interact with, Mr. Speaker? First, it gives them a lot of time to reflect on what they've done, and also a lot more time to be productive, for example, with regards to what they do with their life. Because essentially what we're doing to these people is we're phantomizing them, meaning that to an extent their social growth is stagnated. So when you're alone, Mr. Speaker, and we see this in patients who have been in solitary confinement, we believe that oftentimes a lot of these people do tend to reflect on the crimes that they've committed. And it's less likely that they're recidivists that they will become recidivists, because part of recidivism is rooted in interaction with other prisoners. Like the reason why hardened criminals, people become hardened criminals is because of the formation of prison gangs, for example, because of the rape and sexual harassment that other prisoners do to each other in order to release, for example, their sexual drives that have been repressed. We believe that a lot of these things are very traumatizing for prisoners, and they make them more hardened criminals because they aren't able to reflect on what they do, because it's a fight for survival every day. No, thank you. But more than that, they are co-opted by social hierarchies in prisons, like drug gangs that operate within them, make younger prisoners their mules, for example. On our side, when they cannot interact with each other, there is no way for this to happen. Meaning that the only thing that they can do is attempt to be productive so they don't lose their minds. Given that they have access to educational tools, for example, which are available in prisons right now, we say that that is an encouragement for them to do something so that when they get out of that particular sentence, they can be more productive and they are less likely to be repeat offenders in terms of criminals. So, the last thing that we need to talk about is deterrence. Because remember, in this scenario, you cannot see your family, your friends, you can't write to anyone because they will not be able to see you or hear you or read your letters. For example, it is this fear of deprivation, Mr. Speaker, that will prevent these people from committing crimes again or even committing crimes in the first place, because they know the extent to which they are going to be deprived of that interaction, right? We say that the reason why this is the best way in terms of deterrence is because you prey on an essential aspect of what makes you human, your ability to interact with other people, which means that for the most part, people who become aware of this will be less likely to repeat or do crimes in the first place. So in terms of optimizing the criminal justice system, we believe that this form of retribution is the most ideal in terms of being in line with the principles of criminal justice. In terms of rehabilitation, it optimizes people's ability to not be repeat offenders anymore because it reduces the influences that drive recidivism. And finally, it is the strongest possible deterrence because nobody likes to be alone. Nobody likes to be prevented from being a part of the social collective. For those reasons, we strongly propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Now, we'll open the case for side opposition. I'd like to invite a leader opposition to take
We're glad that side proposition agrees with us that the justice system should prefer rehabilitation over retribution, as they stood for the Norwegian prison model, right? And the idea that retribution basically has no moral worth within society. It is far better to focus on rehabilitating individuals so they can rejoin society. We think that it's queer that they started then talking in a very oblique way, that this is a great form of deterrence, recognizing that most forms of deterrence, firstly, don't work because most people commit crimes with the intention of not getting caught, and therefore that's why we don't that's why the death penalty doesn't work for certain, even like the harshest of crimes, if they think that that trade-off is going to be worth it. And secondly, they need to justify the trade-offs over the fairness of punishment. They can't just run this utilitarian model and then expect us to then buy it. Our counter model is this. We basically prefer to live in a, we think that we should just improve prison systems, right? Like, if you want a Norwegian model, sure, but we think that most societies are unable to fund this because that requires large amounts of taxes. So instead of like things like improving the US justice system or do things such as instead of throwing everyone to jail, what we think is that we should put more people who do non-violent crimes, such as drug abusers, into halfway houses, into parole. Basically, our understanding of how rehabilitation should work is this. Instead of putting you in solitary confinement and away from society, we think increased interaction with society is what is far more likely to be able to rehabilitate you. And let's just get this out of the way. There is a difference between putting you in prison and putting you in solitary confinement. Putting you in prison is us prioritizing the fact that, especially if you are a convicted of a violent crime, we need to prioritize the fact that we are unsure of society's protection over that of your rehabilitation. So we strike that balance and prioritize the fact that perhaps we can't guarantee society that you're not going to attack somebody on the streets again. So we put you away until we can properly rehabilitate you. Maybe they'll take it a little longer, but that was a trade-off we're willing to make it. But let's just clarify first, because we need to recognize that it was important to discuss what kinds of offenses we were talking about. Because we need to ask, right, who are we likely to punish with this wipeout technology? It was very glib for them to say just most kinds of punishments. It is just untrue. You're willing to let this person out, still walking within society, but just unable to interact with almost everybody else. And extended solitary confinement, more or less. Basically, it means that you cannot be in jail for murder, for instance, or other sorts of violent crimes. But you can probably be those who are most likely to fall under this series of punishments are those who display antisocial behaviors that are perhaps not an immediate threat to everybody around you, but we do not like things like child molesters, things such as possession of child pornography and the like, right? So like under these circumstances, this is when we need to ask, is this punishment actually fair? I'm going to talk about two major things within my speech, rebuttals and substantives amalgamated. The first is that we think that this is a cruel and unusual punishment. This is directly dealing with proposition. We thought it was glib for them to say that it was possible to do this without any form of psychic harm towards you, when isn't their entire case about inflicting enough psychic harm on you or psychological harm on you to be able to rehabilitate you? This is why we parallel solitary confinement, because we think that most societies view this as a cruel and unusual punishment, as they admit that the most hardened of criminals are left screaming and broken at the end of maybe a week of solitary confinement. It's because of this, right? We are social creatures and we require social interactions to be able to reaffirm our social identities, right? And we think what solitary confinement does is that it destroys people, because human beings, when they are not able to interact with other people and reaffirm their thoughts and existence via said interactions with other people, are left without said identity. Proposition may come up here to tell us that's precisely what they want. But we think that when the person is left at the end of the day unable to formulate or articulate their own thoughts, in the same way that we realize, especially when we leave like older folks by themselves, dementia creeps in very quickly, Alzheimer's creeps in very quickly. It shows and indicates that there is a huge immense amount of harm that may not be recoverable at the end of the day as a result of your inability to interact with other people. Go.
Ma'am, part of our proposal, which is why it's not solitary confinement, is you can actually interact with, like, for example, educational modules that the state provides so you can be more productive and still retain your mental
You can
faculty.
interact with a robot. panel, like we don't think interaction with a robot or even an artificial intelligence is able to reaffirm your existence and your identity the way speaking with another human being is able to do, to be able to debate with you, for you able to have discussions with you, to talk about the books that you have just read within your educational system modules with you, right? We don't think that any forms of reflection happens on their side. And this is where we are. So we just don't think, we think that side has already failed because they failed to tell us how rehabilitation can happen. But I'm just going to expand on this, and we think that we will further widen the margin of this debate by showing you how you absolutely fail further in rehabilitation, right? Because we need to recognize this. When you are a person who has committed a crime, this indicates, especially if you are a possession of child pornography, indicates that you perhaps have a broken moral compass that we then need to fix before you can be slotted back into society. We fail to understand how removing you from society and removing you from society's norms and your ability to interact with society fixes said broken moral compass. We think, in fact, in isolation, we don't receive feedback from other people or discussions with other people or perhaps the nature of your crime. It is very, very difficult for you to actually be able to reflect about that crime because you only have your own perspectives on the matter. You are unable to interact with other people about their perspectives, right? And we think that their side is the one that creates increased forms of recidivism and increased forms of gang violence, or the propensity to join gangs. Because let's say you're taken out of this kind of this extended solitary confinement, right? You finally think that, okay, it's my turn to recreate and root out my identity again. That's what drives you to tribalism. Because this is when you are in the desperate need to be able to reaffirm said identity and ensure that that identity never goes away again. You are likely to join these gangs and groups to be able to ensure that the identity will always be, these people will always be there to affirm you, and these people automatically give you an identity as a hierarchy ranking member within this gang. So we don't think that's how it even solves that problem. But we think more than likely, you are likely to make this person far worse because you are going to dehumanize the people around you if you have failed and able to interact with them, right? You can only then react physically to the people around you. So we think at the point in time that perhaps you weren't a violent offender, you will eventually become a violent offender. Think of toddlers, panel. Think of they are unable to articulate their words. They are unable to be able to interact with the world except through physical violence. That's why they scream, they cry, they knock things over for your attention. You drive them into that state the second you take away our human, God-given ability to interact with others. For these reasons, we oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of opposition for his speech. And now to continue the case for side government, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to stand. Can you just close the door? Thank you.
The biggest dilemma in the prison system of status quo is that retribution and rehabilitation are on opposite sides of the spectrum. If you want to prioritize one, because of the limitations of status quo, you aren't able to include the other. On our model, we are able to get the best of both worlds because we are able to allow them to necessarily have that retribution towards the victims because we isolate them from the rest of society, but still allow them to access these educational tools such as a library or a gym or all these other things that allow them to master that self-discipline. Because in our model, these victims won't just see these individuals in these Scandinavian prisons, which look amazing. On our model, we're able to balance the fact that these individuals have the tools that they need to become a productive citizen, but at the same time are isolated, and it comes at the cost of this wipeout. That is going to be my extension on how in our model we're able to equalize the currently diametrically opposed political pressure towards retribution rehabilitation and how these prisons necessarily garner that self-discipline. But before that, a few levels of response to the previous speaker. Firstly, we need to realize this whole rebuttal towards deterrence was quite flippant. She simply said, oh, individuals are under the mindset that they won't get caught. Realize that individuals, even when you're committing a crime, you still look at the risk. If what you're doing, for example, if you're a drug mule, if it's going to meet the death penalty, that's still a deterring factor for a majority of individuals. We think that that risk of this possible wipeout is still something they will consider. But moreover, that's not, the deterrence wasn't just for individuals who haven't committed a crime. It's about repeat offenders, which currently constitute 45% of the American justice system. We contend that if you are a person who's already experienced this wipeout, who has experienced this psychological pressure that has been occurred to you, that you never want to experience that experience again in your life, we contend this is the way to set you on the right track, to set you to a place where you won't necessarily commit that crime. We contend and we agree that you crave social interaction after this experience. But it was a stretch for leader of opposition to say that they will revert to tribalism, that apparently they know that if they go to prison, they will have this wipeout, and so what a logical person is going to do is join a gang because that's the best way to avoid the traumatic or that psychologically pressuring experience that you've had. We contend that it's not going to occur. But secondly, she's completely exaggerating the point of how it's going to destroy people. We told you, it's quite clear from Prime Minister, we're going to have psychologists necessarily individually evaluate these particular individuals and adjudicate what percentage or what length of time will be safe enough so that they have that psychological pressure to have that reflective thought, but at the same time not harmful enough so that these individuals will be destroyed or completely gone. But moreover, we tell you that they never analyze the philosophical part of RJ's argument, the conception that your membership in society is based upon your agreement to collective norms or collective moralities, that if you commit something inhumane, such as violence, such as rape, that your membership deserves to be suspended from that society, and we contend in our model, we do that best. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the meaningful interactions that they want to protect on their side. Realize that she never really responded to our point of how those meaningful interactions and engagements work both ways. In the same way as, yes, you can meet your family, you can also be raped by a fellow prisoner, you can also be a first-time offender, and you go into a prison and your roommate is necessarily a hardened criminal, and you come out more criminal or more recidivist than you were before. We contend that these were harms that we purported to you from Prime Minister that this House failed to ignore. They can say, oh, we'll try to improve it, we'll try to remove police brutality, we'll try to prevent these things to happen. Realize that the state cannot be omnipresent. So unless they're going to say they're going to give every single person their own Scandinavian prison, we contend that in our model, we prevent these things entirely. Because the state cannot be there all the time, because we don't monitor all these interactions, we reduce the ability of people becoming hardened, we reduce the ability of people being brutalized, whether by its fellow prisoners or these wardens. We contend that in our model, in terms of these meaningful interactions, more often than not, people become psychologically traumatized, not because of the wipeout, but because they were raped, but because of all these other things. The last thing that we need to realize on their model is this concept of a moral compass. They say it's very important that we remove these particular individuals and that feedback mechanism is going to occur. Realize she never really explained what this feedback mechanism is and how that contributes to that reflective thought. We think that rehabilitation is a process that usually is very individualistic. How so? Because in our model, because you appreciate the severity of your crime, because you're in this state that you've never faced before, that psychological pressure makes you catch up with the truth. Because the true harm in prisons isn't actually just the other people around you, but it's yourself. You're confronted with the reality of who you really are, what you did, and how it creates implications towards society. And we say that that kind of thought, to be able to meditate and reflect on that rehabilitation, is better. Before we move on to my extension, sure.
I'm very confused. Is there any difference at all in your case versus solitary confinement?
Obviously, in terms of solitary confinement, this is actually my extension. The harm with solitary confinement is realize the only way we can induce that psychological pressure is we also deprive them of those tools. We deprive them of all the other interactions. On their model, they're in a single white room and they don't have all these tools at our disposal. Moreover, it's quite costly if you're going to say that they're going to have a solitary confinement of every single person in a Scandinavian prison. On our model, we have one Scandinavian prison and multiple individuals in. So obviously, in terms of cost maximization, we have that there. But now let's talk about the political pressure. Realize that victims right now are always lobbying against all of these added benefits towards prisons. Perhaps the biggest political pressure is of senators to whether they should pander towards the victims or they should pander towards the families of these prisoners and things like that. On our model, unlike solitary confinement, we're able to simulate this concept. We're able to simulate the solitary confinement that you have, but still allow you access to books, still allow you access to all the amenities of this particular Scandinavian prison, and we think that's better. Because in terms of that integration, it's better in our model. Because how do you remaster that self-discipline? What happens in solitary confinement and what happens better in Wipeout? Because you have that no social interaction, you have to keep yourself occupied. You put yourself into a routine. You exercise in the morning. You read books to necessarily invest in yourself. You necessarily meditate and do all these things. You create habits that allow you to regain control of who you are and try to make yourself a more productive citizen, because the end goal of rehabilitation, the end goal of a citizen who has been experienced this isolation is always towards integration at the end. On our model, you remaster self-discipline better, and you can't do that on their model when you put them in a straight jacket and necessarily put them in solitary confinement. We contend that the beauty of the Wipeout system is you deny them from all those harmful, meaningful interactions, and we're able to balance both interests. Your rehabilitation, because we still allow you the tools to have all these things to remaster self-discipline, but we also assuage the victims in terms of retribution because they know that you aren't just in some kind of luxury tax-paid hotel. They know that your family can never read what you write. They know that you cannot socialize with other individuals, and it's still an experience that isn't a reward because that's the perception in status quo. That these prisons, especially in Finland or the Scandinavian countries, is a reward. At the end of the day, we need to qualify. What are these meaningful interactions and do they really help rehabilitation? Moreover, how do we solve the problems that occur because of this interaction? We contend if you violated these norms, your membership in human society should be suspended because it's better for you and it's better for the rest of us. We're happy to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech, and now to continue the case aside opposition, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Nick Stanley.
Mr. Speaker, government has three burdens in this debate. One, to show that current methods of legal punishment are insufficient for certain crimes. Two, to prove that Wipeout is uniquely suited to fill this legal lacuna. And three, to demonstrate that Wipeout, even if appropriate, is morally defensible. They fail on all three counts, and I'll show you why. Three areas. One, on the philosophy of justice. Is there any moral value to retribution? Two, on rehabilitation. How do we help criminals? And third, on debate theory. What do they actually stand for, and what is their case? So one, on the philosophy of justice. Now, their case is a bit confusing. They stand for two premises. One, that it's morally valuable to enact retribution via an attack on identity. I quote the first minute of PM's speech. But two, that these prisons would be Scandinavian and not Abu Ghraib style. This is actually a really inconsistent stance if you think about it. Why is an identity-centric conception of retribution okay, but a physical-centric conception on the attack of your personhood not okay? In fact, the law recognizes that the psychic self is exactly morally equivalent to the physical self. This is why under law, if I sexually assault you, I'll be put behind bars for a far longer period of time than if I physically assault you, even though the physical harms are more or less equivalent, because the law recognizes that the psychological damage inflicted upon the victim is still morally significant. So I'm not sure what their stance on retribution even is. So in comparison, what's our stance? We feel, as a carte blanche principle, there is no intrinsic value whatsoever to retribution. We remove you from society not because you rename membership to society, but because it's the only way we can stop you from hurting others and keep an eye on you for rehabilitation. Retribution is a morally vacant concept. Beyond an innate and barbaric human desire for revenge, we disagree that there's any value to it at all. And then, the second speaker comes and says, yeah, but you didn't deal with our analysis of memberships to society. I assume that it's actually a contractarian analysis, that there's a certain social contract that we all abide by and we break the social contract, that we don't belong to society. Are you Shengwu against that? First of all, why does this contract exist? Did I ever consent to being part of these laws? I've arbitrarily found myself in society, and the only way I can break this contract is to flee to another country with another arbitrarily defined set of rules. It is not sure that a contract signed under duress, because the alternative is a state of nature, is a contract that I should ever be held accountable to. Second, at the point at which I break this contract, I've only caused harm to the person that I've committed a crime against. Why is it that I then rename my ability to interact with people who are not all proximate to my crime? For example, somebody living 20 kilometers down the street whom I've never interacted with at that point in time, who I've never caused direct harm to. This contractual analysis is actually intellectually vapid. Okay, next. Maybe their claim is retribution equal deterrence. Deterrence equal less harm. That's actually a better case. But we are unsure why people are going to be comparatively more deterred. I put to you that it still sucks to be in jail. A gilded cell is still a cell. And most crimes uncommitted on a utilitarian calculus. For example, crimes of passion, or the crime that they told us, right? Drug couriers. Most of them don't think they're caught, and very often they do the crime anyway out of economic duress or due to coercion. Now, we are willing to accept the trade-off. Maybe there'll be slightly more drug couriers on our side. But it's a trade-off that the law enshrines. This is why we don't do things like whip people in public or throw Christians or drug couriers to the lions, right? Because there needs to be a reasonable standard of interaction between human beings, a reasonable standard to which we treat even the worst. That's the entire premise behind why we have laws, and a united stance on how we treat even our worst members. That's the very premise of having things like being innocent until proven guilty, being represented by a jury of your peers. So we think that the whole premise of justice is centered around humane treatment, and the deterrence argument alone cannot win this debate. Second area, rehabilitation. How do we help criminals? They told us about recidivism. We need to stop you from interacting with gang members even when you're in prison. We argue that solitary confinement is actually directly associated with the tendency to join prison gangs post-confinement. Why? Because human beings are not unitary creatures. Our identity is a composite of interactions. And at the point at which we rob you of your personhood, that's when you desperately want to reassert yourself, your social faculties, and join the gang. Because that's very often the only arena through which you can interact and find identity and find people who affirm you. Second response, it often makes you bitter and resentful to the state. Because if they are correct in saying that this is a unique assault on your identity, then this is when people are most likely to join prison gangs in a presumed, desire to want to prevent further such harms. Because they feel protected when they're in the gang. Then you told us, no, but you can interact with books and education modules when you are, wiped out. But this fails to recognize that there is a certain liminal nature to human experience. To be able to interact with somebody who is like you, to feel empathy towards someone else, to engage in a dynamic mental interaction with another living, breathing human being, that's what leads to psychological health. This is why you can't ignore minute 4 and 5 of Nat's speech, which it tells you about Alzheimer's and dementia. At the point in which we cannot mentally interact with someone else, our brain begins to degrade, because a fundamental part of who we are is also who we are relative to other people, how we cartograph our identities within an environment. They gave a very lame response. We have psychologists, so by fiat we win. Actually, prison psychologists are one of the worst possible people you need to be turning to. Like prison psychologists. Before I tell you a story about prison psychologists, go ahead.
Here's the thing, if you're saying that individuals are going to reassert their social faculties, yes, perhaps they'll collectivize or find friends. But why is it, and under any logic, will these individuals commit a crime once they're free?
No, but you're wiping them out when they're in prison, right? So they'll still have a prison sentence to live out. Given that they still have a prison sentence to live out within that social constraints, and given that most of the identities within prison, as you concede, exist within prison gangs, that's when the majority of your prisoners will turn towards these gangs. You have to understand that that's the context you set up in Prime Minister. Back to my case. So, we think that prison psychologists are some of the worst people to turn to. One, the fact that you're a prison psychologist probably means they have experienced a lot of prisoners trying to what we call in Singapore chowking. In other words, get out of prison, face certain problems. They tend to be the least sympathetic towards prisoners. They tend to be really the most screwed up, the kinds of people who will disregard your interests. We think if that's your mechanism, you lose this debate. Then they tell us about prison rape and horrors of prison interaction. 2 responses. 1, then why don't we wipe out everyone, given that these harms are so significant? No response. 2, if you are in danger, we can move you somewhere else. We don't think they've proved that. Anyway, there are alternatives to their case. Finally, on debate theory, what actually do they stand for? Actually, we are unsure that their policy is any different from solitary confinement, because they, I quote PM, put people in prison and then they wipe out some people. So, the only thing that case distills down to is cost. By rebuttal, 1, solitary confinement is actually really cheap. Not assuming that we want solitary confinement, but even if, it's actually very cheap. All we need is to build 4 walls, have a lock, and then put the food through. Not assuming that we concede to solitary confinement, okay? So I'm not sure why the cost argument applies. Second rebuttal, they want closure, right? Can. The family knows the person is in solitary confinement in jail. They feel closure that the person will not interact with fellow prison members. What they haven't done, the failure of their debate theory today, is that they have not shown us the unique value of Wipeout, and they've actually been very cowardly in place setting this primarily in prisons. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for the speech. Can we now have the
in the current prison system, it is all the interactions when these prisoners form gangs or do the daily chores that they don't feel safe. The fact that they don't feel safe, rather, it's all these things that hinder these prisoners from actually inspecting themselves. This act of introspection, which is so important for these people, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that, and in this debate, I'd like to isolate and confine in two issues. Firstly, in terms of the extent of punishment, because Opside obviously says that it's too much. And secondly, how do we really improve systems? This is where opposition was a little bit more oblique and obscure. Firstly, in terms of the extent of punishment, what they say to us in today's debate is that there's too much punishment. Let's talk about solitary confinement, ladies and gentlemen, because what they said is that, oh, in solitary confinement, people are going insane. That's simply not true. There are people that have been placed in solitary confinement for years and come out, and while there has been psychological harm, which we do intend to do, we don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that they've gone to the extent that they have Alzheimer's or dementia. Number two, I'd like to point out that there is a difference between solitary confinement and the extent of psychological harm versus phantomization, which is what we want on our side. Number one, the solitary confinement is in terms of a 6x6x8 cell, and the only companion you have is a bed and a metal toilet. We think that there's a relatively more freer movement, ladies and gentlemen, inside an entire prison system, that you won't feel the added burden of claustrophobia versus simply isolating what we want, solitude for this particular person, and we think that solitude is important. Number two, what they said was that solitary confinement is really cheap anyway, let's just do it. That's simply not true. If you compare solitary confinement in Supermax in the United States, it costs $90,000 per person versus the 45,000 USD that's needed for a single person, normal person. And why is that? It's because for every interaction, for all the food that person has to eat, all the change in linens, that in terms of cleaning the toilets, ladies and gentlemen, all of these have to be done manually by a particular person, ladies and gentlemen, just to keep sanitary conditions, ladies and gentlemen, just to keep it humane. So we don't think that stands. Lastly, their attack on prison psychologists. While we may agree that there is an incentive in status quo for bad prison psychologists, we don't think that we have to defend that, right? We can just show you an alternative in terms of how there is a capacity for the scientific community and psychologists to come together and create studies for them to actually ascertain what is the appropriate amount of psychological harm, the actual intent of what the extent of psychological harm we want, and how long that's going to take, ladies and gentlemen. So we don't think we have to define or defend this idea of prison psychologists being the worst out there. So what did they really? So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that phantomization isn't as bad as what we claim. That we get to isolate the solitude that we want to impose on these people, and I'm going to talk about why that's important later. Number two, under extent of punishment, the only thing that stands again coming from opposition is that this idea of anti-retribution, which is also a little bit anti-prison system in general, anti-punishment. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that this assertion coming from the previous speaker of how retribution is morally vacuous holds water, given the fact that when you interview all the people who've had their daughters raped, what do they tell you? They tell you that they'd like to kill them. They'd like to be the ones that strangle them themselves. And those are raw emotions, human emotions, ladies and gentlemen, that are experienced by these people. No, thank you. And that's the reason why we have to have a balance behind retribution and exacting a particular punishment on these people. So we get to assuage all these raw emotions, that we can't just let these people have no punishment on them, ladies and gentlemen. There has to be some psychological harm. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that psychological harm shouldn't be in terms of an inhumane treatment. It should be in terms of an exact treatment, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that solitude is something that is important to exact in these people. So we do think that there is a value of retribution, and this is a particular mechanism that we get to balance rehabilitation with retribution. And this is where I'm going to go with the second issue in terms of how we really get to improve prisons. The first thing that happened in today's debate in terms of improving prisons, no thank you, is that the idea of drug gangs within prisons, ladies and gentlemen. And we get to clean this up because there's greater safety. You don't have to interact with other people. They don't see your race. And there's no incentive for other prisoners to attack you based on your race, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why prisons are incredibly unsafe right now. That's why they collectivize based on race right now. So we actually remove that already. So we think that's something that we get to remove in status quo, ladies and gentlemen, based on interactions already. What did they provide to you? No, thank you. They told you that after they get in, after post-confinement, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to collectivize, they're going to form gangs. While that might be true, they had shared experiences in that particular place, right? Because there are no other people that experience this particular phantomization. While it might be true that they might want to talk with each other, they might want to collectivize outside, we don't understand why they would do crimes outside, ladies and gentlemen, because they were because they were phantomized rather, ladies and gentlemen, because they were wiped out. We don't think that there was any logical lead to that. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that what's more likely is that these people are going to talk about it talk about it and collectivize in that manner, but still be able to go back to their families, get employment, and such, ladies and gentlemen, and not really be trapped in terms of gangs and do crime at the end of the day. No, thank you. Secondly, we talked about the idea of prison rape and brutalization. This is something that is going to be corrected given the fact that you can't rape someone that you can't see. You can't beat up someone, ladies and gentlemen, that you can't see aside from a silhouette. Lastly, in terms of rehabilitation, and this is the most important thing, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that when you interview a lot of people that have been in solitary confinement, how did they prevail from that psychological harm? They meditated. They read books, ladies and gentlemen, the ones that had access to them. They exercised a lot, ladies and gentlemen. These habits continued after their solitary confinement. And this solitude that was provided to them that gave them access towards these different mechanisms of self-improvement were the things that made them more competent in the prison system. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that isolating this solitude in this particular form that doesn't go too far to say that they are in solitary confinement are things that are tools rather that we can use in order to reform them at the end of the day. Mindfulness and mindfulness and solitude, ladies and gentlemen, go hand in hand with introspection of why they committed crimes in the past and what they should do in the future when they get out of prison. And this is really important in terms of how we want to reform them at the end of the day. For all these reasons, we think that it's a good idea to wipe out these people.
Mr. Speaker, if you, Mr. Speaker, and maybe the rest of the House and everyone who's watching here, perhaps more importantly you guys, if you thought that this motion for this House will update the solitary confinement system to reflect Scandinavian policies, I can't blame you. Because that's what happens when your gov refuses to properly explain when, why, and what circumstances this particular new punishment will be useful in. I want to bring you back a few minutes in this debate, when the first speaker said that our only burden in this debate is to prove that the absence of social interaction is the best punishment. No, that can't be your burden, because this burden simply goes to showing why you have incarceration, why you have solitary confinement, but it most certainly doesn't show why you need a wipeout. I think, at the very least, it was their burden to show us why specifically the wipeout punishment as a new form of punishment that judges should use in their tool or arsenal of particular tools of punishments should be put into place because nothing else would work. Because absent of this, why don't we just use any other punishment? And that was the thing I consistently tried to ask them through 21 minutes of speech, and they refused to give us an answer. Every constructive that they've given us up to this point supports either incarceration or supports solitary confinement, but doesn't explain why. Also, in DPM, they seem to have forgotten the info slide, because the info slide clearly explains that you can to some extent interact with society just as society sees you as a shade, which importantly means that this cannot be a debate about solitary confinement, since you are able to some extent have interaction with society. Never mind that. I'll give you at least two other areas in which they had a gov case. First, for one, you can't write to loved ones. Insofar as that's the case, while you can do that as solitary confinement, this is a new level of punishment, a new level of humiliation they were talking about, but they didn't choose to run that. Second, you can interact, but the society and your government has seen fit to strip you of every version of your identity, and also another aspect that they refuse to go and touch on. But happily for them,
Our case deals principally in any case to solitary confinement, even though we were happy to support Scandinavian systems of enlightened prison systems. But there are two aspects that we think are concerned here. A principal one and a practical one of rehabilitation. The first issue, sure.
Okay, first of all, please don't burden push and say that we are defending solitary confinement. In fact, my whip already differentiated what we're defending from solitary confinement. You need to rebut what we defended and not your conception of what we defended.
No, I'm not burden pushing. I'm simply explaining what I think is reasonable for you as a proposition to explain in good faith to the rest of this House by what the motion said you needed to do. To that extent, if you're asking for us to consider a new punishment, the simple burden you needed to prove was why any other punishment wasn't good enough in any case. First, what are the principles that guide justice? Because we thought as a starting point, there was a minimum bar to how you could conduct certain versions of justice. That's why we don't do things like torture. This came out as early as NAT, but I don't think they saw it because we didn't hear a response. Our proposal to you is that we similarly don't want to move towards worse prison systems, and we agree that to the extent that we are able to earn the side of more rehabilitative focuses, we should. Happily, they agreed. And we're happy to accept that once we agree that the principal goal should be rehabilitation, then this new question that they floated about the social contract actually clearly doesn't matter anymore. Because it's not a principal justification of whether or not you consented in or out of society, because the new end game that we need to concern ourselves is where do we put the prisoner in the best place to rehabilitate themselves. So that issue is also out of this debate. But just to be sure, if you want to have a gripe about whether or not a social contract is an issue, I will refer you to both Chin and Nat's speeches. But even if here, we're happy to say that incarceration similarly takes you out of the society of the social contract that you said you broke and should therefore not be able to be part of. Again, conclusively dealt with. But let's focus on what this debate should have been and perhaps was the focus. What is the best way to rehabilitate these individuals? Their starting point was deterrence. And I think, as a minimum level, they needed to explain to us what specific use or specific forms of deterrence that was useful. Otherwise, let's just use every other thing. Because we are very capable and happy to say that every other version of punishment can already calibrate to the level of deterrence that we need. So what was so specific or lacking in the system currently that we need to use wipeouts as a form of deterrence, in addition to everything my previous two speakers have already given to you? But the meat, recidivism that they brought out. Or rather, let me start with what they thought were the two differences, no thank you, that they proposed. First, political tools that we are now able to inform these individuals in these wipeout conditions about new things that they should be relevant to or be aware of in these when they go back to society. That is clear because the motion and info slide says that your only ability to interact with the rest of society is through this tool, which now has been turned off, but suspiciously has not been explained by prop why we suddenly can turn it on in these circumstances, but never mind that. We try to explain to you that in our current systems, there are already means which we're able to socialize you back and give you a sneak peek into what you want to look at. If it's not there, let's just add it in. There's no need for us to use this wipeout system in any case. The second thing they said to you is that we provide greater safety in the interim because current prison models kind of suck. To that extent, we're happy to agree to you. And this is not an intractable problem that hasn't already begun to be solved. Many prison systems are already working against these particular types of poor, cancerous situations to begin with, and we're happy in the interim to say that there are many means in which we can secure the safety, such as a means testing versions of allocating particular prisoners to suitable facilities in the interim. But all these are truly just mitigatory, because the heart of our case was simply this, that wipeouts, we thought, was so grossly and so inhumane a form of treatment that we cannot use it in any circumstances. And the reason is very simple. That when you leave these individuals, even in solitary confinement, there's absolutely no hope, or you put them in much worse places of rehabilitation. I understand that some people have happily went and meditated and got out of their circumstances, but these people have gotten out in our circumstances in many ways and faster. But for the rest of these individuals, the rapists that they themselves mentioned, the only person they are left with when you put them in wipeout is the demons that force them to do the punishments to start with. And we think that's horrible. And the reason why Chin gave you the example of prison counselors is because sans interaction with anyone else, that's the only other person that you can reasonably expect to interact with. The problem is that all prisoners have absolutely no incentive to buy into or trust these prison counselors as a whole, which reduces us back to the same person, the same demons, and the same instructions of the peoples or the personalities that they had. Nat talked to you about why, in the reconstruction and rehabilitation of these individuals, being able to negotiate and talk to these societies is important in being able to construct your new identity when you go back to these societies. Therefore, or that was why interaction was so important. That's why if we hope to bring these individuals back to society, it is important for them to first talk to the people in society that they were coming back into. That's why we oppose.
This is probably the hardest reply I've had to write all tournament. Not because we were losing, but because this was a government that so thoroughly self-combusted. It was very difficult for me to pick up the pieces and figure out what they stood for at the end of this debate. Theirs was a side that stopped, that let's just recognize that their whip even stopped defending the moral reasons to why this punishment was justified and was left with piecemeal claims on how this was cheaper and how you were basically less likely to be raped by somebody you couldn't see. And let's just start from the beginning. So the Prime Minister emphasized that the thrust of the Prime Minister's speech was that the rehabilitation was important and that it worked. Never mind, like, justifying why this particular piece of technology was something that was able to give the mutually exclusive benefits that they claimed that it did. Then the Deputy Prime Minister stopped that. And then he shifted the debate into about how this was one about how we achieve retribution, right? Because current prison system models are too soft, and we need to be able to appease the angry victims who don't like that the people, the perpetrators, are living in Norwegian prisons. So bear with me. I'm going to talk about two things within this debate. First, is there harm inflicted upon you when you are wiped out? And secondly, which is the side that achieves rehabilitation better? Because we think that given that they've dropped the moral grounds, we want that, right? So is there harm or undue harm inflicted upon you when you are wiped out that is unique to this piece of technology? Let's just point out this major contradiction coming out from their side. They cannot simultaneously tell us that there is harm. It's not that bad, but it is great enough that no other piece of no other tool that we have in our current arsenal is able to achieve this. And at the same time, it's still strong enough to be able to create additional barriers of deterrence for all the other kinds of for these crimes within society. So we thought that was already self-defeating on their side's part. But we did tell you that this was about undue damage, right? We did tell you that psychological harm was sometimes the worst possible harms, worse perhaps than the physical harm that you could potentially inflict upon a human being, and it was very difficult to recover from these mental scars as a result. Moving on to rehabilitation. When you are devoid of human interactions, was their side's claim, it's only then will we then begin this self-reflection process of like yoga and Zen and like self-discipline. Let's just recognize that this was only an assertion, right? And it completely didn't deal with the fact that we are social creatures, that we require this feedback mechanism, that the average ordinary citizen does not have the self-discipline, perhaps, to always continuously reflect upon their actions. They oftentimes need incentives and triggers from interactions that they have and conversations that they have with other human beings within society. Go, maybe there's an alternative viewpoint. Maybe I might be potentially wrong because someone I respect is telling me otherwise. As Brian said, their side is essentially locking up these people that we recognize are possibly messed up, have broken moral compasses with their own demons, and leave them alone to sort themselves out. We fail to understand how they recognize rehabilitation. In fact, we think plenty of people in status quo within solitary confinement, like they're playing down harms. A lot of people come out after a week with depression they did not have before, with suicidal thoughts that they did not have before, and that is an irreparable harm that they are inflicting far worse onto these people. Because when you are able to see these silhouettes and these chants and hope for interaction, when you shout and scream at other people but they are unable to say anything back to you, that is when you are more likely to resort to more violent physical actions to be able to force them to recognize your existence and your identity. That was why we thought you created more violent tendencies amongst these people. My substantive never dealt with. Look, we never sat here and stood for the US prison model. I think I came out quite clearly in my counter policy. And this was about reducing the fucked up ways in which the US constantly sends people of non-violent crimes into prisons. It was about recognizing that the proper form of rehabilitation was always about increased forms of interaction with society. And that was how we fix these people. For these reasons, we oppose.
Now sum up the open grand final, like if I government replies to this.
For the longest time, we have opted to hide behind human interaction to avoid self-reflection. What government side defends in this debate is the idea that when left to themselves, prisoners are better able to understand why they are there and how they can stop being there and how they can rehabilitate in the future. What we get from opposition bench is a lot of poo-pooing and criticism that we aren't really proving anything. When in reality, Mr. Speaker, they're only choosing to ignore a lot of the analysis that we gave. Like, for example, they have this entire idea that retribution inherently has no value. If that is true, why is it that the leader of opposition seems to still imply that they defend the existence of prisons, right? They just say they should be more rehabilitative, but to some extent they're still there and people are still separated from society. Which means that the second speaker's argument that retribution is terrible is already in tension with the very first argument that they ran on their side or even their setup. So on that level, there's really no way that they're going to be able to win this debate. But secondly, they accuse us of having zero setup, as if I didn't spend the first 1.5 minutes of my Prime Minister's speech outlining what the world would look like, i.e. Scandinavian prisons, for example, they have access to educational content. In fact, they were rebutting so many of the prongs in my proposal and then accusing me of having no proposal, which is kind of really funny if you think about it, Mr. Speaker. But they were actually very unresponsive to a lot of nuances, and I'm going to go step by step so that they understand why this strategy was really poor. The first thing that they said is that there's this need for human interaction, that we are dehumanizing these prisoners by taking them away. They threw us a burden to prove why our version of punishment is superior. And actually, from the Prime Minister's speech, there's already a discussion of what interaction looks like in prisons that we have and in the prisons or whatever rehabilitative thing they have. Like, there's a tendency to form social hierarchies in terms of organized crimes, for example. The fact that prisoners get raped, for example, or they join gangs, and all of these things. Absent those stimuli, absent those temptations, when you can't interact with them, what are you left to do? That's when the second thing that we talked about came around, Mr. Speaker, when we talked about introspection from our second speaker. The idea that people start to build habits, which we already see in status quo, as discussed by both DPM and government whip. Again, no response coming from their side because the only thing that they wanted to talk about was that we had no links. But what were their links? They said people need to interact in some way. Okay, but how does that interaction lead to better rehabilitation, Mr. Speaker? They just said it will, but they never actually proved how it is going to happen. Fluffy rhetoric is not enough for that, Mr. Speaker. That is still an assertion. Therefore, we really have to ask, what do they want? If they want less recidivism, they had to prove that. If they wanted deterrence and said that on our side there was less deterrence, why is it better on their side? We're not really sure because even they weren't sure whether they wanted some prisons or no prisons because they seem to oppose retribution. What does this leave us, Mr. Speaker? This leaves us with a lot of argumentation that still stands on government side. The concept of balancing rehab versus retribution, for example. The existence of having the need to balance the existing social pressure to punish with the need to change these prisoners' lives. On their side, it continues to be skewed, right? Because there is still a demand on their side, for example, to punish these people to the worst, in the worst way possible and to condemn them to a life in which their only interactions breed recidivism, Mr. Speaker. So we see that they cannot deny the existence of their harms. Why do we collectivize? And sorry. One last thing. Sorry, because this is really funny. They said that when we release them, they're going to band together into a tribe and commit another crime. Like, why is this really funny? Because after I got out of prison and I was wiped out, Why would my next response be to collectivize and to commit a crime that might get me back to the wipeout? Why will I not seek my children or my family? Why will I not seek my friends? They never really talked about these likelihoods. They just sort of asserted that that was what's going to happen. How very convenient, Mr. Speaker. And these conveniences cannot win them the debate. Thank you.